lawyers are about to fire off a letter to House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, refusing to comply with Democrat subpoenas until the full House votes on the impeachment inquiry. And now CNN has learned the White House is lawyering up, seeking outside impeachment counsel. Blocking testimony. The White House orders the president's EU ambassador not to testify before lawmakers and says it's done playing nice. Now House Democrats say they'll subpoena the ambassador. Calling Trump first. CNN has learned that the EU ambassador called President Trump during the 4-hour gap before he responded to a text message from another U.S. diplomat who warned that holding up aid for Ukraine for help with a political campaign was, quote, crazy. And favoring the inquiry. A new poll shows a majority of Americans support the impeachment inquiry and that more Republicans may be breaking with the president. Will public backing for the impeachment inquiry change how Republicans respond on Capitol Hill? Wolfwitzer is off today. I'm Brianna Keeler. You're in the Situation Room.
This is CNN Breaking News.
The breaking news this hour, a significant escalation of the impeachment battle between the Trump administration and House Democrats. White House lawyers have written a letter that they're about to deliver telling House Speaker Nancy Pelosi that they won't comply with Democrat subpoenas, arguing that current impeachment proceedings amount to an illegitimate effort to overturn the 2016 election results. Also breaking, committee chairmen investigating the president now say they'll subpoena the U.S. ambassador to the European Union after the White House suddenly blocked his congressional testimony today. Sources are also telling CNN that at least one National Security Council official alerted the White House's national security lawyers about concerns over the president's call to the Ukrainian president and Mr. Trump's effort to get dirt on Joe Biden and his son. Those lawyers later ordered the transcript of the call moved to a highly classified server. We're going to talk about the breaking news with Congressman Ruben Gallego of the Armed Services Committee, and our correspondents and analysts are also standing by. First, let's go to CNN Chief White House Correspondent Jim Acosta. And Jim, there are some major developments in this impeachment battle.
That's right, Brianna. The White House is on a collision course with House Democrats over the impeachment inquiry. The president's legal team is expected to fire off a letter at any moment to Speaker Nancy Pelosi, refusing to cooperate with the investigation. The president, meanwhile, is stoking these tensions, declaring he won't cooperate with what Republicans are calling a kangaroo court. CNN has also confirmed the whistleblower at the center of the inquiry wrote a memo describing a White House official who listened in on Mr. Trump's conversation with the Ukrainian president and characterizes that conversation as, quote, crazy and frightening. The official was left, quote, shaken by what Mr. Trump said during the call. A key signal the White House is ready for combat. The administration blocked the U.S. ambassador to the European Union, Gordon Sondland, from telling what he knows about the president's phone call with the leader of Ukraine about Joe Biden. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo was mum on the subject.
Mr. Secretary, why don't you instruct Ambassador Sondland?
Thank you all. Good morning.
House Democrats warn White House stonewalling won't make their inquiry go away.
The failure to produce this witness, the failure to produce these documents, we consider yet additional strong evidence of obstruction of the constitutional functions of Congress, a co-equal branch of government.
The president tweeted, Sondland won't be testifying. I would love to send Ambassador Sondland, a really good man and great American, to testify, but unfortunately he would be testifying before a totally compromised kangaroo court, an echo of GOP talking points.
What we see in this impeachment is a kangaroo court, and Chairman Schiff is acting like a malicious Captain Kangaroo.
A source familiar with internal White House discussion said the decision to silence Sondland is part of a new aggressive counter-impeachment strategy. That source told CNN, quote, the days of playing nice are done. The defiant posture comes even as the president continues to insist his call was perfect.
The people understand it's a scam. They're trying to win an election in 2020 by using impeachment. If you look at that call, it's a perfect call.
Democrats are zeroing in on an exchange of texts between Sondland and a top U.S. diplomat in Ukraine, Bill Taylor, who appeared worried that the administration was holding up aid to Ukraine around the time of Mr. Trump's July 25th call. As I said on the phone, I think it's crazy to withhold security assistance for help with a political campaign. Sondland replied, Bill, I believe you are incorrect about President Trump's intentions. The president has been crystal clear, no quid pro quos of any kind. I suggest we stop the back and forth by text. Before Sondland sent that response, he called the president. CNN has learned White House and national security officials scrambled to contain the fallout of Mr. Trump's comments on the call, including moving the rough transcript of the conversation to a more secure system. Fellow Republicans see no wrongdoing.
The president's doing his job. President, when you're talking about the hard-earned tax dollars of the American people going to a foreign government, the president's going to make sure that there is no corruption there.
Still, a new Washington Post poll found 58% agree that the impeachment inquiry should have begun, a huge jump from over the summer. Trump ally Senator Lindsey Graham is calling on the president's personal lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, to talk to lawmakers. Giuliani's response, love Lindsey, but I am still a lawyer and I will have to deal with privilege. For now, Democrats sound like they want to hear from Sondland first.
This is sort of like a classical Nixon-type Watergate action, which is that the cover-up often becomes even worse than the crime itself. So the White House and the State Department continue to orchestrate this massive cover-up by stopping witnesses that had actually prepared to testify.
And the White House has just released the letter that it is sending off to the House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and the chairman of the relevant committees leading the impeachment inquiry. We don't have enough time to put this up on screen for you, Brianna, but I can read to you a key sentence from this letter. It says, as you know, you have designed and implemented your inquiry in a manner that violates fundamental fairness and constitutionally mandated due process. It says, for example, you have denied the president the right to cross-examine witnesses, to call witnesses, to receive transcripts of testimony, to have access to evidence, to have counsel present, and many other basic rights guaranteed to all Americans. So, Brianna, we're obviously going to be reading through this letter as we speak, as are other reporters over here at the White House, as are Democrats up on Capitol Hill, and I suspect you're going to have some responses coming from the Hill shortly, Brianna.
All right, Jim Acosta, thank you so much. Let's get more now on the breaking news with CNN senior congressional correspondent Manu Raju on Capitol Hill. So, Manu, what are the chances that House Democrats have the whole House vote on initiating an impeachment inquiry in response to this letter?
Well, very slim. Nancy Pelosi has made clear that she would not be pushed by the president to hold a vote to formalize an impeachment inquiry, in large part because the Democrats argue it is simply not necessary. They say that under the rules, they can certainly launch an impeachment inquiry and vote to impeach this president without having to formalize a formal probe. Now, at the same time, having a vote to authorize an inquiry could lead to some other complications. Republicans could argue that they should have subpoena power as well as past impeachment inquiries have allowed. Similarly, it could often it could lead to political and practical problems. It could take lots of time on the House floor, make difficulties in actually drafting a resolution to authorize a formal impeachment inquiry, and it could also put some Democrats in difficult positions, particularly ones who represents districts in Trump that the president carried in 2016. So the Democrats are really in no rush, and they say they're not going to get pressured by this White House. So expect the stalemate to persist, and eventually the Democrats to make a decision on impeachment, Brianna.
So what do they do after this witness is blocked? What happens now?
Well, we do expect, at least at the moment, on Friday, the former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, Marie Yovanovitch, to come before Capitol Hill. But it's possible her testimony could also be delayed because she is still a State Department employee. And as we saw today, the State Department said that its employees should not participate, and that's the White House's position as well. So if with Democrats lead to a number of these witnesses not coming forward, they're saying that essentially this could be rolled into an article of impeachment saying the president has obstructed Congress. And they're citing the Nixon impeachment proceedings, the articles of impeachment that had been drafted for President Richard Nixon, to say essentially it's similar here that the president is interfering and obstructing Congress. And when Nancy Pelosi today was asked about that specifically, she would not rule that possibility out. Says she's not prejudging the situation, but said the president's move today was, quote, an abuse of power. Brianna?
All right, Manu, thank you. I want to get more now on all of this with Democratic Congressman Ruben Gallego of Arizona. He is a member of the Armed Services Committee. Sir, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So the White House is threatening they're not going to cooperate with his impeachment investigation unless the full House of Representatives votes to open a formal inquiry. Obviously, we have heard what the Speaker thinks about this. But do you think that the House should hold that vote? And if not, why not?
Well, first of all, those that are being prosecuted rarely get to set the rules of the prosecution. So the president and the Republicans really cannot dictate this. And partly, most importantly, we know that they are not going to be acting in good faith. They have not acted in good faith at all throughout this process. They have stonewalled, whether it was during the Mueller investigation or now they're even stolen right now by denying access to information and to witnesses that we have a right as Congress to have oversight. So this is another move, just throw dust up in the air. But more importantly, it really just leads to a bigger issue that this is just another process of obstruction that warrants, I think, us going after the president for articles of impeachment regarding obstruction.
As the White House stonewalls on testimony and Democrats are poised to issue subpoenas, how do Democrats proceed with impeachment as some of these other issues play out in court?
Well, I think in terms of impeachment is if they continue stonewalling, you just roll that right into the impeachment in regards also with all the other crimes and misdemeanors that we have seen. So, for example, the extortion of a foreign country for personal gain, that's an article of impeachment. And now if they keep on obstructing, both abuse of power and obstruction of justice are also going to be on the table. So the president can stonewall, but it's not going to change the outcome. It's actually most likely only going to increase the outcome of him being formally impeached by the House.
So could you hold an impeachment vote without testimony from Sondland, without testimony potentially, we're waiting to see, from the former ambassador to Ukraine, from maybe a number of other State Department officials who are involved in this?
Certainly we can. If the reason they are not testifying because this president is actively obstructing us doing our oversight duties as well as getting that information, then that itself is an article of impeachment. If you look back at Watergate, it wasn't just the fact that they broke into the Watergate, it was all the actions afterwards that were part of the articles of impeachment. So the president is either going to have the easy way or the hard way, and the easy way is to actually comply with us, allow these State Department employees and all the other information we need to actually make a determination, or else he's still going to get impeachment in the end, and that's just because of obstruction of justice and obstructing Congress.
When one American diplomat texted Sondland, quote, "I think it's crazy to withhold security assistance for help with a political campaign," CNN actually learned that what Sondland did was he called the president, and 4.5 hours later is when he texted a reply. It was a very legalistic message saying the president was, quote, crystal clear that there was no quid pro quos, as he put it. What do you make of that?
Well, I think this is just CYA politics, cover your ass politics that the ambassador was doing. And I think he was coordinating with the president of the United States. Like common criminals, they were coordinating their alibis. Also, let's not forget, they were having this conversation over WhatsApp, right? This is official communication that's happening between ambassadors, the administration, and the president, and they were doing it on WhatsApp, at least in between these two ambassadors, not between the president. They ran a whole campaign last year about the State Department or 2 years ago, doing communications over unsecured network. WhatsApp is unsecured, and the fact that we don't actually have any of the information that they were texting to each other is also a problem. The State Department needs to turn over all texts that were in between these two ambassadors.
Since I have you, you're on the House Armed Services Committee. I want to ask you about the president's decision to pull U.S. troops out of northern Syria. Many members of Congress, Republican and Democrat, have criticized this. You've signed on to a letter calling on Defense Secretary Mark Esper to answer questions about this decision. What specific concerns do you want him to address?
Well, we want to know exactly who did the president talk to before he made this decision? What was the cost-benefit analysis? Were there other considerations taking place? How long did the president actually take to actually have this information? Who gave him advice? And we want to know what the motivation is behind that. This is a very dangerous situation. We are about to lose one of our closest allies in the Middle East, an ally that's stuck with us through thick and thin. And also, it's going to destabilize our alliances all over the world because people and countries are not going to be able to trust us in the end if they see how we treat the Peshmerga and the Kurdish people in terms of what's going to happen in northern Syria. And already, by the way, Turkey has already started attacking that area after there was promises that we gave that there would not be any attacks on the Kurdish areas.
The Kurds are currently in charge of detention centers for many, many ISIS fighters and associates of ISIS. And they have said essentially that they may just need to walk away from those facilities as Turkey invades. How likely do you think that is?
Look, I can't predict it, but I think this also produces a better question. What has this presidency and what has this administration been doing for the last couple months that they did not actually foresee this problem? They did not try and negotiate a separate truce or a separate peace between Turkey and the Kurds, or at least some level of security agreement so we wouldn't find ourselves in a situation. What they were doing is Pompeo was traveling the world trying to fabricate lies against a political opponent of the president instead of actually doing some real serious work in northern Iraq. That is the problem that you have here. That is a damn shame, and it's going to cost us geopolitically in terms of our alliances probably for decades to come. Pompeo is the failure in this situation. Pompeo should have been working this out, should have been pressuring the president to work this out. Instead, he's just the president's lapdog and is going to continue to engage in these failures on the international scheme.
Congressman Ruben Gallego, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
And coming up, we have more on all of our breaking news. The White House sends House Speaker Nancy Pelosi a defiant letter refusing to cooperate with the impeachment probe until the full House votes to open an investigation. Defiant late afternoon letter. President Trump's legal team tells House Speaker Nancy Pelosi there will be no cooperation in the impeachment probe because the full House has not formally voted to open an investigation, and largely because they do not see what's going on as an actual impeachment inquiry. In fact, quotations are used. So let's bring in our political, legal, and national security experts to discuss all of this. Okay, so, I mean, first off, Susan Hennessy, to you, he's saying essentially, or his lawyers are saying, I should say, that there are numerous legally unsupported demands made as a part of what you would have labeled contrary to the Constitution. And then let's look at this part. This is near the end of the letter. It says, given that your inquiry lacks any legitimate constitutional foundation, any pretense of fairness, or even the most elementary due process protections, the executive branch cannot be expected to participate in it, because participating in this inquiry under the current unconstitutional posture would inflict lasting institutional harm on the executive branch and lasting damage to the separation of powers. You have left the president no choice. Consistent with the duties of the President of the United States, and in particular his obligation to preserve the rights of future occupants of his office, President Trump cannot permit his administration to participate in this partisan inquiry under these circumstances.
Yeah, so as a constitutional level, that's what we call complete and total nonsense. The Constitution tells
that's the technical term?
Technical legal term for it. The Constitution does not lay out how exactly impeachment should proceed. It says that it's up to the House to decide. Now, in the first impeachment of Andrew Johnson, the House actually just impeached him and then said, oh, maybe we should draw up some articles of impeachment. So there really isn't a huge precedent here. Now, before Nixon's impeachment inquiry and before Bill Clinton's impeachment inquiry, the House did have formal votes. That's because of the committee rules that existed at the time. The judiciary committees did not have the ability to issue those subpoenas, so they needed a full House vote in order to empower the committees to do things like take depositions. Fast forward to today, the committees already have those authorities under new rules. So what they're asking Nancy Pelosi to do is take a purely symbolic vote. And mind you, amidst all of this blistering language, they actually aren't even making a commitment. This letter is not saying, hey, if you have this vote, if the House does take this purely symbolic step, then we'll produce the documents. That might actually be something that a deal Nancy Pelosi might be willing to make, but that's not the offer.
She sounds like she's not really willing to make that she's not going to be pushed by the president, thinking that before that might actually be the offer.
Well, look, this is a political response to what was a political move by Nancy Pelosi, who wasn't going to take a vote because she doesn't want to give Republicans subpoena power, and that this would give them subpoena power, and she doesn't want to give her members a tough vote to take if it's going to be tough for some of them. But this document is not a let's get to yes document. Let's find a way where we can work this out document. This is a political document which says that not only is this unconstitutional, but you've been trying to get rid of the president since the day he was elected document. And so this is very strong politically, but legally, I'm not a lawyer, but
How much of being impeached depends on the willingness to going along with being impeached?
Well, so this really is following the example of Richard Nixon. The House is trying to put the White House between a rock and a hard place. Either Trump has to produce these witnesses, and keep in mind, just one witness coming forward, Kurt Volker, produced those really, really astonishingly damning text messages, or he has to say, we're not going to cooperate at all. That can serve as the basis for obstruction of Congress articles of impeachment. So really, it is a no-win situation for the president at this point.
And Kylie, they're not getting cooperation from at least one State Department employee and possibly more.
Yeah, that's right. So just this morning, in a shocking announcement, we heard from the personal lawyer of Ambassador Sondland that he was being prevented from going and speaking to Congress. So what's interesting there is that we heard from the committees on the Hill that they were in touch with the State Department's legal counsel last night, and they got a message from the State Department last night at 12:30 a.m. that said that they would no longer allow Ambassador Sondland to go and speak. So the other thing here is that we saw last week Secretary Pompeo send a similar letter, similar to this language, to the committees on the Hill, essentially saying that there were legal questions about what they were asking from the State Department and not making any commitments. So similar to this letter from the White House, there's no hard and fast commitments, but they're muddying the waters here, and they're introducing a number of questions that then folks who are watching from home are saying, what's going on here? What's legally possible? What's not? But at the same time, they're preventing folks from the State Department from talking.
Sean, what's your reaction to this?
Yeah, well, I think that, Kylie's point about muddying the waters is absolutely right. This letter, as I read it, is another attempted delay. And I think the administration, the White House, the lawyers there understand that the longer you can drag this out, the longer you can kind of tie this up. If you can slow Nancy Pelosi and the Democrats down, then you can definitely kind of stretch this out a little bit. So, and look, on Ambassador Sondland, I mean, this is look, he's going to have to take a hard look at the ramifications of being subpoenaed and whether or not he really wants to do that, because obviously there's personal liabilities associated with being subpoenaed and not showing up. So my take here is that this is a game of chess, and as the White House decides to move the pieces around, as long as they can stretch this out, they're going to win, but I'm not sure they're going to be able to pull that off.
And look, at the end of the day, this is about giving members, Republicans in Congress, something to focus on other than having to defend the president's substantive conduct. None of them want to go out on record and say, we have no problem with the president of the United States pressuring, extorting a foreign leader to investigate Joe Biden. This gives them something else, some sort of process crime or process foul that they can focus on so that they actually don't have to answer those very, very difficult questions.
All right, all of you stand by for just a moment. We're going to get in a quick break. We have so much more to discuss, political and legal experts. And Gloria, part of this letter, it says, the invalid impeachment inquiry plainly seeks to reverse the election of 2016 and to influence the election of 2020.
It's a political document.
That's right.
I mean, this is a political document. You've never wanted him to be president. Even before he became president, it's stated somewhere in this document.
Can I ask, that may be true, but isn't it also possible that there is a real case against the president? And these two things are not mutually exclusive.
Right. And this is a political document saying this is unconstitutional, et cetera, et cetera. The point that I think is very interesting, as if, and they say the president's being denied basic constitutional protections, but they also say that the committee has resorted to threats and intimidation against potential executive branch witnesses. I ask you, what has the president done to the whistleblower? Threatened the whistleblower, tried to intimidate the whistleblower, said that the whistleblower is treasonous, a spy. The people who talked to the whistleblower were spies, if not worse. This coming from the president of the United States is, I would say, threatening in the extreme. And they're trying to say that the committee is threatening these witnesses, when in fact what they want them to do is testify privately.
Are the president's constitutional rights being violated here?
No, so this is essentially the president saying that he wants to set the rules for how an impeachment inquiry goes in the House of Representatives. The Constitution says that the House of Representatives gets to set those rules. Now, certainly past houses have decided to extend certain procedural protections to the president, things like allowing the president's counsel to be present. Now, one thing that Nancy Pelosi might do at this point is say, look, give us a list of the procedural protections, specific procedural protections that you would like that the president doesn't already have. in exchange for a very firm and clear commitment to waive executive privilege, produce all documents, all testimony that the committee requests in a timely manner. That might be the kind of thing that the House actually would be willing to agree to. But this is not a serious
This is not a
document.
let's make a deal.
Well, let's talk seriously about where this goes. I mean, this is at a complete impasse. So what happens, Sean? I mean, where does this go? The courts obviously can play a role in this, but that can be quite slow. So what happens?
Well, look, when you read this letter, I think that what everyone said about this letter is true. I mean, this is a political document, but I also think that for all of those people out there who might want to come forward and speak out, this letter is also a message to those people. But I think that what the president, what his team does not understand is that while there are a lot of people who fall under the president's kind of political umbrella, there are also a lot of civil servants out there, a lot of career professionals out there who have knowledge about what happened here and who will have the courage to come forward. So where does this go? Well, I think that we're going to continue to see more people speak out. We're going to continue to see whistleblowers come forward. I think ultimately the White House is going to continue to fight this, but this probably will end up in the courts. And as I said before, the longer the White House can stretch this out, the more they can kind of engage in this fight as we get closer to the election, the better it is for the White House. So the Democrats have to sit down and really figure out what their strategy is, and they've really got to send a clear message that for people who might come forward, that they're going to be protected and that they want to hear from them.
This ending up in the courts. I mean, that just seems like this amorphous thing that happens so far down the road.
Yeah, and I also think it's important to note that they're putting a lot of these U.S. ambassadors in really awful, awkward positions right now. So we have Ambassador Sondland, who wasn't allowed to go up to the committees today because White House counsel told the State Department he shouldn't go. Now we have the committees saying that they are going to be subpoenaing him for the documents and for his testimony. So he's going to be stuck between a rock and a hard place because the White House is telling him not to go. He's going to face a subpoena. Then we also have Ambassador Yovanovitch, who's supposed to be going on Friday. According to what we see here, it's pretty clear that the White House is not going to let her to go.
Not to mention that Congress is supposed to be informed, Kylie, of these things. And right now, you almost, even of the things that might, let's say, be deemed legitimate from a Republican perspective of just keeping Congress in the loop on foreign relations, this creates a breakdown there, too.
Completely. And we also have another ambassador to Ukraine right now who has been revealed in some of these text messages. He can't come out and defend himself. The State Department has not come out and defended him or defended the former ambassador there, Yovanovitch, who Trump has publicly said negative things about. So the State Department is in a really hard place right now.
But look, at the end of the day, these kinds of hardball tactics are really the White House essentially saying we are going to force the crisis. We are not going to back down here. And the idea that if the House of Representatives and the Democrats just sort of back off a little bit, that somehow the White House is going to become more cooperative is ridiculous. And so I really think this is a message to House Democrats that, look, the White House is going to fight this tooth and nail. The only response is for you to fight just as hard with your constitutional prerogative.
If Pelosi were to come out tomorrow and say, okay, we're going to have a vote, then the goalposts would be moved. And she wouldn't get anything in exchange for that from the White House. So it's not like this is a document, as was, earlier we thought, well, maybe they'll send a letter that say, if you do X, we'll do Y, and we'll come up with some kind of arrangement. That's not what this letter is.
Does this go to the Supreme Court?
Potentially, although
I mean, they're saying it's a constitutional issue, even though we know that's not phooey.
These are not. This is a political question, and impeachment ultimately always is a political question. The idea that the Supreme Court is going to weigh in on this 18 months down the road, years down the road, that's not realistic, and that's why Congress needs to decide whether or not it takes itself seriously on this matter.
And yet, we're seeing a complete and utter breakdown in the way these branches of government that there's supposed to be a tension between them, Sean.
Well,
but right now,
tension.
it's beyond tension. I mean, this is a complete and utter breakdown that means the country can't operate, the government can't operate the way it should.
No, it absolutely is. And look, it's being felt inside these agencies. Look, the White House can fight this all they want, but there's one thing that the White House and people on either side of this can't fight. There are a lot of documents out there. There's a lot of documentation out there that will tell us exactly what happened here. And once that documentation comes to light, the White House is going to be in a position of saying what you see here on paper, what you hear in these calls is not actually what you're seeing and hearing. And so that's one of the reasons why they're pushing so hard on this. You know, we've talked a lot, Brianna, about Ambassador Sondland and these text messages. You know, we talk a lot about the phone call between Ambassador Sondland and the president after Bill Taylor sent the text message. But if you recall, Bill Taylor's first text message started with, "As I said on the phone." And I'm told that members of Congress are really very interested in that conversation because it just seemed as though Sondland was pretending as though this was the first time he was hearing Bill Taylor's concerns. But clearly there was a conversation where they talked about it. So there's a lot more that will come to light here.
Can I ask you real quickly, Gloria, because we have to go, but this all started with this, well, really the transcript and the complaint and learning what happened, which was it's a very concerning thing that happened, digging for dirt on Joe Biden in exchange for military aid. But does this just end in posturing that goes to the election?
You know, it may. I mean, look, this is, you know, the summary of that conversation is out there. That's what the story is about. The president asking a foreign leader to do his opposition research and holding up money for Ukraine. Period. End of story. End of paragraph. All the rest of this is going to be how everybody in the White House was reacting to it, how they got nervous about it, how a whistleblower was so offended by it that took the steps that he or she took to get this out there. That's the story. The rest of this, as we are talking about in this letter, is all about process. It's all about partisanship and politics. The question the American public has to answer is
Declaration of defiance against impeachment investigators. The president's lawyers just sent a letter to House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. It spells out the administration's refusal to participate in the Democrats' inquiry, arguing that it's unconstitutional. The letter all but dares Pelosi to hold a formal vote to open an impeachment probe, a step that she has resisted. And this comes only hours after new stonewalling by the White House. It blocked a key witness in the Ukraine scandal from testifying on Capitol Hill today. Tonight, Democrats are firing back with a subpoena for Gordon Sondland, the U.S. ambassador to the European Union. I'll be getting reaction from Democratic Congressman David Cicilline. He is on the Judiciary and Foreign Affairs committees, and our correspondents and analysts are also standing by. First, let's go to CNN Chief White House correspondent Jim Acosta. And Jim, the president is ramping up his constitutional clash with House Democrats.
That's right, Brianna. The White House is starting a constitutional fight with House Democrats over the impeachment inquiry. The president's legal team has just fired off a letter to Speaker Nancy Pelosi refusing to cooperate with the investigation. The president is stoking these tensions, declaring that he won't cooperate with what Republicans are calling a kangaroo court. Meanwhile, CNN has also confirmed the whistleblower at the center of the inquiry wrote a memo describing a White House official who listened in on Mr. Trump's conversation with the Ukrainian president and characterizes that conversation as, quote, crazy and frightening. The official was, quote, left shaken by what Mr. Trump was saying during the call.
It's a fraud.
Escalating his standoff with House Democrats, President Trump is refusing to cooperate with the impeachment inquiry. In a letter to House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, the White House accuses Democrats of trying to play politics, stating, your unprecedented actions have left the president with no choice. In order to fulfill his duties to the American people, the Constitution, the executive branch, and all future occupants of the office of the presidency, President Trump and his administration cannot participate in your partisan and unconstitutional inquiry under these circumstances. A key signal the White House is ready for combat. The administration blocked the U.S. ambassador to the European Union, Gordon Sondland, from telling what he knows about the president's phone call with the leader of Ukraine about Joe Biden. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo was mum on the subject.
Mr. Secretary, why don't you instruct Ambassador Sondland?
Thank you all. Good morning.
House Democrats warn White House stonewalling won't make their inquiry go away.
The failure to produce this witness, the failure to produce these documents, we consider yet additional strong evidence of obstruction of the constitutional functions of Congress, a co-equal branch of government.
The president tweeted, Sondland won't be testifying. I would love to send Ambassador Sondland, a really good man and great American, to testify, but unfortunately he would be testifying before a totally compromised kangaroo court, an echo of GOP talking points.
What we see in this impeachment is a kangaroo court, and Chairman Schiff is acting like a malicious Captain Kangaroo.
A source familiar with internal White House discussion said the decision to silence Sondland is part of a new aggressive counter-impeachment strategy. That source told CNN, quote, the days of playing nice are done. The defiant posture comes even as the president continues to insist his call was perfect.
The people understand it's a scam. They're trying to win an election in 2020 by using impeachment. If you look at that call, it's a perfect call.
Democrats are zeroing in on an exchange of texts between Sondland and a top U.S. diplomat in Ukraine, Bill Taylor, who appeared worried that the administration was holding up aid to Ukraine around the time of Mr. Trump's July 25th call. As I said on the phone, I think it's crazy to withhold security assistance for help with a political campaign. Sondland replied, Bill, I believe you are incorrect about President Trump's intentions. The president has been crystal clear, no quid pro quos of any kind. I suggest we stop the back and forth by text. Before Sondland sent that response, he called the president. CNN has learned White House and national security officials scrambled to contain the fallout of Mr. Trump's comments on the call, including moving the rough transcript of the conversation to a more secure system. Fellow Republicans see no wrongdoing.
The president's doing his job. President, when you're talking about the hard-earned tax dollars of the American people going to a foreign government, the president's going to make sure that there is no corruption there.
Still, a new Washington Post poll found 58% agree that the impeachment inquiry should have begun, a huge jump from over the summer. Trump ally Senator Lindsey Graham is calling on the president's personal lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, to talk to lawmakers. Giuliani's response, love Lindsey, but I am still a lawyer and I will have to deal with privilege. For now, Democrats sound like they want to hear from Sondland first.
This is sort of like a classical Nixon-type Watergate action, which is that the cover-up often becomes even worse than the crime itself. So the White House and the State Department continue to orchestrate this massive cover-up by stopping witnesses that had actually prepared to testify.
Now, senior administration officials just wrapped up a conference call with reporters about this letter to the House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. Officials were asked on that call what Democrats would have to do in order to secure the cooperation of the White House in the impeachment inquiry. One administration official said the White House did not want to get into hypotheticals at this point, indication that the White House at this point is digging in its heels and daring Pelosi to take Mr. Trump to court. Brianna, it is not a stretch to describe what we're seeing right now playing out here in the nation's capital as a constitutional battle that is headed for the courts. The stakes have not been this high, I would say, Brianna, since the days of Bill Clinton's impeachment and perhaps Watergate. Brianna.
Jim Acosta at the White House, thank you. And let's head to Capitol Hill now for more on this breaking news. CNN congressional correspondent Sondland Serfaty is joining us now. So, Sondland, what does this letter mean for Democrats and how they're going to conduct this impeachment inquiry?
Well, no doubt, Brianna, this will most certainly escalate the already very intense clash that's going on right now between House Democrats and the White House. But Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, she has been very clear that she is not going to succumb to White House pressure when it comes to at least putting pressure on them, pushing for a full House vote on the full House floor to authorize an impeachment inquiry. She has not ruled it out in the past, but she's been very clear that she does not believe that she is required to do so. Many Republicans, in the meantime, too, are arguing for a full House vote, arguing that it would potentially give them more power than they have right now, potentially giving them even a chance to subpoena their own witnesses, subpoena their own information here. But this letter, most likely tonight, not only just essentially will just throw a lot of more fuel on the fire for Democrats and the White House. And Democrats have made it very clear that this essentially only adds to this case that they are building. This White House stonewalling just adds to their case about obstruction, which they say will potentially factor in to articles of impeachment. Brianna?
Sondland Serfaty on the Hill, thank you. And joining me now is Congressman David Cicilline, a Democrat who serves on the Judiciary and Foreign Affairs Committees. Sir, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
In this letter, the White House argues that your impeachment inquiry is illegitimate and unconstitutional. What's your response to that?
Well, you know, it's certainly not appropriate or permissible for the subject of the impeachment inquiry to challenge the process. This is an impeachment inquiry that has been underway and now underway by 6 committees of jurisdiction. This is an effort by the president and his legal team to distract from the core allegations of the impeachment inquiry. The President of the United States pressured a foreign leader to gin up dirt on a political opponent and withheld military aid as a leverage to do that. This is shocking behavior. It was confirmed by the president's own admissions on camera. It was further confirmed by the transcript of the telephone call, and of course, finally confirmed by a very elaborate whistleblower report that details the entire scheme. Every day we learn new evidence which corroborates this shocking behavior of the president. And rather than confront or answer or be held accountable to that conduct, he's attempting to challenge the process by which Congress is doing its oversight work. These are lawfully issued subpoenas. This is oversight and now an impeachment inquiry that Congress has a responsibility to do to demonstrate no one's above the law and to hold him accountable. And despite their best efforts to distract the American people away from the facts, we're going to continue to press for the truth, to gather up evidence and hold this president accountable.
Congress's oversight role here is being neutered by the White House. Is this a constitutional crisis?
Well, I think the chairman of the 6 committees of jurisdiction have made it very clear that when subpoenas are issued and documents are requested and witnesses are directed to appear, that the White House's continued obstruction of Congress will be considered just that, obstruction of Congress, which was the third article of the Nixon impeachment articles. I think we're going to make every effort to collect additional corroborating evidence. We already have more than sufficient evidence to move forward. So I think you'll see the chairmen of the committee continue to do their work, but they have already made it very clear to the president and to the White House that they will consider any efforts to defy these subpoenas as further evidence of obstruction of Congress in our effort to get to the truth. And ultimately, that will very likely be one of the articles of impeachment that we move forward on.
So this is not a constitutional crisis? What do you think about that?
Well, I mean, I think, this is unprecedented to have a president of the United States direct members of administration to defy subpoenas, to refuse to testify, to refuse to produce documents. This is really unprecedented. Congress has a responsibility to conduct oversight. It's a particularly serious responsibility in the context of an impeachment inquiry. And certainly the executive branch doesn't have the ability to end that or limit it by simply refusing to comply. So my guess is the courts will ultimately direct their compliance. But the important thing is, we're not going to engage in a protracted legal battle and let the president and his administration run out the clock.
But you don't have a
sufficient
choice.
evidence.
I mean, he's forcing you into a protracted legal battle.
No, I disagree. We do have a choice. We already have sufficient evidence. We have an admission from the president. We have a transcript of the recording. We have the whistleblower report.
So when will the vote on impeachment be, do you think?
Well, I mean, that will be up to the committees of jurisdiction to complete their investigations and make a referral to the Judiciary Committee. But I think it needs to happen quickly. We want to be thorough and we want to be careful about collecting all the evidence.
Is quickly months? Is quickly before the end of the year?
I think it's months. I think before the end of the year. I think before the end of the year for sure. We cannot allow the president to obstruct Congress, to try to run out the clock. We have the whistleblower who has provided this information. We have the president's own admission to the misconduct. We have this transcript of the phone call in which it's laid out. Plain and simple. There's really no additional evidence you need. We're being very careful to collect more. But in my view, there is more than enough evidence to move forward with articles of impeachment. The president betrayed his oath of office. He betrayed American national security. He undermined the integrity of our elections. This is serious. As the Inspector General said, it is urgent and credible, and we need to move forward because Congress has a responsibility to protect the national security interests of the United States.
It is serious. You say you have enough information to move forward with this impeachment inquiry and ultimately impeachment, which you'd like to see soon. Do you have enough information in order to convince voters and maybe to convince some Republicans to make this actually a successful effort?
Well, I think we see public opinion is turning a majority. I think it was 58% of the American people believe it's appropriate to move forward with the impeachment inquiry. So we've seen a big change as the American people see in real time. This is the president of the United States using the power of his office. We should remember Ukraine is an ally of the United States. They were attacked by the Russians who took a part of their country. Their lifeline to hold on to their democracy is American military aid. And here's the president of the United States saying, I need a favor from you, though. And he asks him to basically basically gin up dirt on his political opponent in exchange for this military aid. And we see these text messages in which a diplomat is saying this is crazy to link military aid to this investigation that the president is seeking. We shouldn't lose sight. This is the president of the United States asking a foreign power to interfere with an American presidential election.
He said that, as you know, to Gordon Sondland. And you were not able to hear from Gordon Sondland because the White House directed the State Department to block him from testifying. You found out at the last minute. Can you move forward without some of that contextual information that obviously someone like Sondland or maybe the former Ukraine ambassador who you're supposed to hear from, but maybe you won't, without them talking to you about it?
Absolutely. We should remember, we have the admission from the defendant. That is Donald Trump. He's admitted the wrongdoing. It's on television interviews. He's acknowledged he had the conversation. It's corroborated by his own words in the transcript of the phone call, and it's detailed. The entire scheme is detailed in the whistleblower report. We have all that's necessary. Our effort now is to collect additional evidence to further corroborate it, but the president is engaged in an ongoing cover-up, an obstruction of Congress. This is a pattern, his effort to prevent Congress from getting the balance of the story. But we will consider that obstruction of Congress, which in and of itself is an impeachable offense. So we're going to do our best to gather up corroborating evidence over the next several weeks. But if the president thinks by delaying this and by attempting to obstruct Congress that he's going to prevent us from moving forward, he's sadly mistaken. We have ample evidence. It's shocking behavior of the president. It's illegal, and he needs to be held accountable for it.
Congressman David Cicilline, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
And we do have some breaking news in subpoena issued for Gordon Sondland, both for testimony and for documents. We're going to follow that. And at this point in time, the White House has issued a letter to House Democrats, but it's not saying that tonight the Trump administration puts its impeachment stonewalling strategy in writing, the White House notifying Democrats that the president won't participate in the impeachment inquiry. The president's lawyers arguing it's unconstitutional, in part because the House has not voted to open the investigation. Joining me now, former U.S. attorney and CNN senior legal analyst Preet Bharara. Preet, thank you for joining us to lend your expertise here. So this letter from the White House accuses House Democrats of violating the Constitution, the rule of law, and every past precedent of impeachment. What is your analysis of this document?
So, it doesn't read principally as a legal argument. It reads like a rhetorical document. It reads like a political document. I frankly expected better argument. But the one thing I think people need to be aware of and be considering as we move forward through this process is these arguments are going to be couched in legal terms and couched in terms of precedent. But there are very few precedents when it comes to both this administration and also when it comes to impeachment. It's only happened twice before successfully. So there's lots of circumstances that make it like other cases and lots of circumstances that make it a case of first impression. And you know that this is not really based on legal principle and constitutional principle. And how do you know that? You know that for a couple of reasons. I think, one, it took them a while to write the letter. They had agreed to have, I think, Ambassador Sondland come and testify. He got on a plane from Belgium, was about to land, or maybe already had landed, when they changed their mind. So if it was really all about constitutional principle and everlasting, dogmatic principles of law, I think they would have said that from the outset. I think they made a tactical and or strategic decision that they didn't want this to go forward. And the other example is, of course, the thing that set a lot of this into motion. They could have made lots of arguments, constitutional, precedential, legal, ethical, or otherwise. Maybe they would rise, maybe they would fall. But they could have made those arguments about the whistleblower's complaint and the readout of the conversation between President Trump and President Zelensky, and they chose not to make those arguments because they thought those documents may not have been so harmful to them. So I think here they have made a decided political, strategic calculation that to cooperate would be terrible for them and would be worse for them, and they're couching it in a lot of flowery language, which is their right.
We're now seeing at this point in time House Democrats really get bogged down in this process. They can't get access to witness. They can't get documents here. You're certainly familiar with trying to make a convincing case. So how do Democrats, and granted, they are seeing a shift in the polls here, but it may not be enough at this point. How do Democrats make their case to the American people in light of these obstacles, which may not be this obstruction argument as compelling as other arguments?
Well, first they should, turn over every rock, and they should, follow the leads wherever they find them. They're going to have more luck, given the status of this administration and the letter they just sent. They're going to have more luck talking to people who are not within the government, and they're going to have an easier time compelling people who no longer work in the government or ever worked in the government and maybe have some inside knowledge because people told them things. They're going to have better luck with that. Second, with respect to things that they're not getting directly from the administration, they've already made it clear, and there is precedent for this in other impeachment proceedings, they made it clear that to the extent they are not being cooperated with, to the extent they're not getting information they're asking for, testimony or documents, that they will draw an adverse inference, and they will call that obstruction. And that alone, those are separate standing articles of impeachment potentially, and they have some. Again, all of this is infused with politics and public sentiment. They have some leg to stand on because this is no longer what the White House might have called a fishing expedition, trying to see if there's some malfeasance. The cat's out of the bag. We know about the conversation between the president and the president of Ukraine. We know about the other issues relating to the segregation of some of these conversations in a special secret server. And so I think a lot of people have been affected by this information and know that it's bad. Will they get to the bottom of everything? Probably not. Lots of criminal cases are made with enough evidence to make the case and to prove the case to a jury, not the Senate, but a regular jury of people's peers. And you can still do that without having everything. But I think the adverse inference principle is going to weigh heavily here.
Preet, thank you. Preet Bharara. We appreciate your perspective
Good to be
here. We have more breaking news ahead on the White House all but declaring war on the impeachment investigation. Is this a constitutional crisis? And will it force House Speaker Pelosi? The Trump White House is drawing a line tonight against House Democrats. The president's lawyers sending a letter to House Speaker Nancy Pelosi declaring that Mr. Trump will not participate in the impeachment inquiry, arguing the probe is illegitimate. We are following this breaking story with our correspondents and our analysts. We have Pamela Brown, David Swerdlick, Laura Coates, and David Chalian with us. And I want to see what you all think about a key part of this letter. It's rather long, right? This is 8 pages long. And this is a key part. Quote, given that your inquiry lacks any legitimate constitutional foundation, any pretense of fairness, or even the most elementary due process protections, the executive branch cannot be expected to participate in it because participating in this inquiry under the current unconstitutional posture would inflict lasting institutional harm on the executive branch and lasting damage to the separation of powers. You have left the president no choice. Consistent with the duties of the president of the United States, and in particular his obligation to preserve the rights of future occupants of his office, President Trump cannot permit his administration to participate in this partisan inquiry under these circumstances. I mean, Laura Coates, explain sort of what this is. This is like an accused dictating the terms of their investigation.
I mean, it's absurd in a word here, Brianna. How can there not be a constitutional legitimate basis when the Constitution is what outlines the process of impeachment? Now, it's not specific enough to be able to say, here's all the House rules that will govern the actual process, but it actually vests this entire power in the House of Representatives. And we have, unfortunately, as a nation, done this several times before in the modern era. But in order for the President of the United States to say this is a kangaroo court, what he's missing is it would be a kangaroo court if, in fact, somebody who is accused of an impropriety is allowed to dictate the terms of the investigation into that, particularly when it's founded principally on his own statements. Let's talk about the Mueller report versus the Ukraine call and the discussion about the China interference discussion. With the Mueller report, the question was whether the President of the United States had engaged in behavior that may lead someone to believe in an abuse of power, let alone a crime. In terms of this accusation right now, it's more than that. It's based on the President of the United States' own statement. Now the question is whether it is in fact impeachable. The fact that the President is now saying that I can't possibly be allowed to participate or couldn't do so is really violative of the special separation of powers and thumbs its nose at the power of Congress. The Founding Fathers said they get to have.
David, what do you make? David Chalian, what do you make of this letter?
Yeah, well, listen, this is not, as you know, impeachment is not a legal process. It's a political process. And so this is a letter of political posturing. This is a letter trying to sort of lay the groundwork here of how the White House is going to fight this politically, how they want to start swaying the American public before the House Democrats lay out all the evidence they have, vote on articles of impeachment. This is an opportunity to make this a pure partisan brawl in the minds of Americans, to really try and convince America that this is broken politics as usual, nothing to see here. But everything that Laura just said, make no mistake about this, this is a constitutional crisis. This is the executive and legislative branch now in an all-out war. I don't know how that could be anything but a constitutional crisis.
Yeah, I agree with you, David. I just posed that to a Democratic congressman who would not bite when I asked that question, perhaps because of the consequences it might trigger. What do you think, David Swerdlick?
So it could be a constitutional crisis. I agree with David's analysis, but I don't think it has to be for this reason. The letter on its face is actually doing a lot with not that much. The White House counsel is trying to make this case that essentially we're not going to deal with the substance because the whole process is bogus. The problem with the letter is there's no muscle behind it. The House, as Laura said, has the prerogative to impeach. Impeachment is not a trial and not removal. It's essentially an indictment. And Speaker Pelosi and her caucus control the action here. If I were Speaker Pelosi, I would buy every member of my caucus a copy of Doyle Brunson's Super System. The key to winning a high-stakes poker showdown is to put the other side to a decision about everything they've got. And what the White House is trying to do is make Democrats take a vote to say we're having an impeachment inquiry when the House can vote whenever it wants. The House has the option of voting at any time to put the Senate to a vote on whether or not they will convict, even if the House comes back with one article of impeachment.
You know, Pamela, you have some fantastic reporting that really sheds light. It kind of gets in the way of the president's argument that this was a perfect call and the White House's general argument that there's nothing here. You have reported about what was going on in the White House. This is separate from the whistleblower. What was going on in the White House right after this call was made in late July with the president of Ukraine?
Well, Brianna, our team was told by several sources that at least one NSC official, almost immediately after the call between President Trump and the president of Ukraine, raised a concern higher up to the NSC lawyers. This person was concerned that the president had talked about Joe Biden and asked Zelensky to look into his political opponent. We were told that after that, that is when the NSC lawyers then decided to put the transcript of that phone call into that secret code word server. The concern, we're told, had to do with wanting to suppress leaks, limit who saw it. Also, one person told me that they also thought maybe we should preserve this in case this becomes part of an investigation. There was also this internal discussion of what do we do about DOJ? Bill Barr, the Attorney General, was mentioned several times during the call. Should we loop in DOJ on this? Ultimately, DOJ says it was never looped in. But what really stuck out to me in talking to sources was that the White House counsel's office tried to keep a very close hold on this early on. It was alerted to it by another agency before the whistleblower complaint was filed. And it thought that it could be dealt with within the executive branch and that all of these allegations wouldn't see the light of day. When it became clear, though, that that whistleblower complaint would likely be turned over to Congress and they had essentially lost the battle to keep a close hold on it, that is when you saw a change in posture within the White House. And ultimately, the White House released that transcript that it's now using in this argument in the letter as an argument of, hey, look how transparent we've been.
It's so hard, Laura Coates, to fend off the sunlight that that someone's going to come forward. This information gets out. And yet I think the question a lot of people have is, to what end? Because here we have this information. Pamela has fantastic reporting. We're learning about this behind the scenes. But where does it take the country?
Well, you know, the question I think a lot of people have is all of this an exercise in futility? You know, there is that modicum of him is called a moniker called Teflon Don. And I think a lot of people in America, and of course, it requires the electorate to go along with the impeachment process. It's why they're there and trying to delicately go on the tightrope if you're a Democrat or Republican of whether your constituents are with you. But the idea of whether all of this will run off the president's back like water on a duck's back, and that will have really long-term consequences for the democracy. democracy. Because to answer your question, Brianna, frankly, we're only in a constitutional crisis if Congress truly backs down and panders to another branch of government. You're not in a constitutional crisis unless the other branches say, uncle, okay, we're going to give in here. But now that they're coming forward and saying, here's what we're going to do, here's how we're going to flex the power, and that question that the president could normally ask, you and what army, if that means nothing all of a sudden, the constitutional crisis removes and democracy works as it is. But the American people are asking themselves, where will this take us? What will happen? And is democracy really just dependent on one president's discussion about either his taxes or a phone call? Is that all it's come down to after all these hundreds of years?
Experts were following all of the breaking news in the impeachment investigation, including where do the American people stand on this? House Speaker Nancy Pelosi has not ruled out a formal vote, and now we have some new polling on this issue. There's a new Quinnipiac University poll, and it shows 53% support the impeachment inquiry. That number is even higher in the Washington Post poll, 58%. David Chalian, how might that influence the House Speaker's next steps?
And we should note, Brianna, that 58% is some 20 points higher than it was back in July, which is why I think what is so critical in this polling that we're seeing is sort of the context is key here. The 2 years of the Mueller investigation in Russia, when impeachment questions were asked, the country just wasn't there at all. This seems to be a new context for voters as they are assessing this, and they see that the impeachment inquiry, half of Americans, slightly more there in the Washington Post, see this as a totally valid inquiry on this set of facts, on what they see here about the president's, interfering potentially with the 2020 election, not something in the past, with his own direct actions on a released transcript, phone call with the leader of Ukraine. I think because the fact patterns are different, we're seeing differences in the American people. And to your question about Speaker Pelosi, she has to watch these numbers very carefully because in terms of pacing, the timing of this investigation, and it being seen as fair, this is going to be critical for her and the Democrats. I've said this from day one when she started this, to bring the country along in this process for it to be successful.
And how do they know, David Sword, what the critical mass is, Democrats, when they're looking at poll numbers, a critical mass that might signal to them that they can change minds of Republicans in Congress?
Sure. So I think Democrats have to look at these polls like you look at any polls, as a snapshot at a moment in time. You have the Q poll and the Post poll with a majority of Americans saying they support the inquiry, not necessarily removal of the president. That should tell Democrats that they're on surer footing than they were, as David said, than they were with the Mueller report. Speaker Pelosi has credibility here because she was the one putting the brakes on impeachment until this set of facts came out. And then it was like, release the hounds. But they've got to see how the polls progress with each step in this process. I think Democrats, have to look at this and say, things could change up or down. If this drags on till Thanksgiving, Christmas, maybe the polls will go in their favor. Maybe it won't as the facts get more muddied up and this becomes more about process, as we saw with this letter from the White House.
And Pamela, the White House is now arming themselves. They're accepting some outside legal help. You have breaking news on this. What can you tell us?
Yeah, that's right. We're told that the former Republican South Carolina Congressman Trey Gowdy, who many of us know, was actually at the White House today. He had been asked to help from the outside in terms of counsel in the impeachment fight. And we are told, my colleague Caitlin Collins and I are told that he accepted this, that he is willing to help on that effort, on that front, on the outside. What is interesting about this is, as the White House tries to argue today in this letter that this isn't even a formal impeachment inquiry and we're not going to, cooperate with you, clearly they are bracing for an impeachment fight ahead as they bring outside lawyers on board.
I want to take a look at this Washington Post poll and what it shows in terms of the breakdown among parties. 28% of Republicans support the impeachment probe, Laura, and there are 57% of independents who do. What do you think about that?
Well, you look at that and say there are people who, this is obviously not a partisan issue specifically, and here's why I think that. Unlike other issues about maybe litigating, as was alleged, a past election or a discussion about Hillary Clinton or about a deep state theory, the notion of abuse of power and foreign interference or soliciting the help of a foreign nation should be really a neutralizer for a lot of people to say this isn't about Republicans versus Democrats, nor is the issue of whether the executive branch can thumb its nose cameras at the legislative branch and essentially emasculate the congressional leaders and congressional bodies in this way. So it actually tracks for me why this would not be such an issue that is falling along partisan lines, because abuse of power, frankly, is a victim of both parties, and also both parties can many times be the ones who are in trouble.
David Chalian?
And Brianna, can I just want to say that 28%, I mean, think about everything you've seen in polling in the Trump administration. How often have you seen 3 in 10 Republicans be in a position against the president on something? Not that often. You don't see that kind of number. So that's a warning sign for the administration. And that 28% number, by the way, in July in the Washington Post was 7%. So again, there's been movement here. I think it's why you saw a few cracks emerging, some Senate Republicans coming out and saying what the president did was wrong, even if they're not ready to get behind an impeachment inquiry. But I do think that number is alarming to the White House, and it's something they have to track very closely.
David Swerdlick, to Laura's point about abuse of power being something that both parties do, it is so noteworthy how people change their tune when they are on different sides of the situation. Trey Gowdy in the past, who's now going to be working in this impeachment fight on behalf of the president. The notion, this is a quote, the notion that you can withhold information and documents from Congress, no matter whether you are the party in power or not in power, is wrong. Respect for the rule of law must mean something, irrespective of the vicissitudes of political cycles. That will certainly be used against him.
Oh, it certainly will if he's working on the president's legal defense, because part of the president's legal defense has been to not cooperate with the investigation, whether it's his tax returns, whether it's not producing Ambassador Sondland today, all of the things that the administration has stonewalled Congress on. I think one of the things that's going to work against the president's defense, again, not saying he's going to be removed, but one of the things that's going to be work against his defense, both in terms of how his lawyers play it and the public perception, is that some of these documents are out there. People can see the text messages. People can see the transcript of the conversation. They don't have to, when you ask them in a poll, they don't have to say, what is this about? They say, oh, I read about it in the newspaper.
Thank you all so much. And Laura Coates, we're going to be